Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all here this evening for Involve's 20th anniversary celebrations. Woo! So, if you're in the room for any other reason, then you might want to go now. But I can see people helping themselves to drinks and so on. It's really fantastic to see so many wonderful people in the room this evening to celebrate what I think is a real achievement 20 years on. And throughout the evening, we will be hearing different stories about Involve, what it's done, what it's achieved, and indeed thinking a bit about the future as well. For those that don't know me, I'm Ed Cox. I am chair of the Involve Trustee Board, and so it's my privilege to open up this evening. And we've got all kinds of activities lined up. We've got speakers, we've got a panel session, we've got more participatory activities, as you would expect from an Involve gathering like this. So Sarah will tell us a little bit later about what we're going to be doing this evening. But I wanted to use the opportunity in opening this event to share a couple of personal memories and further reflections. I think my first real encounter with Involve was with Rich Wilson, who's here today, and Edward Anderson, who, when I was at that stage, was that 2008, I was working as a policy advisor for Hazel Blears, who at that point was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. And we were working on what was then known as the Empowerment White Paper. And we were casting around for different ideas to improve public participation in decision-making at every level. And I remember Rich and Edward and other members of the Involved team at the time being incredibly helpful in feeding in ideas and very practical, giving us very practical advice about how we should write that white paper. And I would say that even to this day, Involve is the go-to organisation for how-to guides on public participation and deliberation, with its amazing knowledge base, which you can now find on the Involve website, and a staff team as well who really know their stuff. Unfortunately, the Empowerment White Paper, I don't know if others remember it, was, I think, in the end, a bit of a damp squib. It was called Communities in Control, and number 10, under Gordon Brown, I think, lacked the energy and the confidence to really drive forward the agenda at that point in the political cycle, if you like. And so we couldn't even get Metro mayors over the line through that Empowerment White Paper. Now, there's a huge amount that can be said about those, if you like, intervening years, the 14 years between that Labour government and the new Labour government that we've got now. I became chair of Involve in 2019, when I think it's fair to say democratic reform and public participation were not really high on the political agenda. It was, though, a time when Metro mayors were introduced, perhaps the most refreshing change to English democracy that we've seen in the past decade or so. And then, of course, there was the Brexit referendum in 2016 as well. Again, I'm not sure that can be described as a democratic innovation given the way in which it was used and applied. Internationally, though, this last decade has painted a very, very different picture. And over that time, we've seen what has been described now as a deliberative wave sweeping across the world, with governments all around the world not only experimenting but increasingly institutionalising deliberative methods and approaches and building them in some places to their constitutional architecture to draw people closer to power, both nationally and locally. And I guess you could say we've also seen something of a deliberative wave in local government in the UK, with Involve very much being at the forefront of that process too. So scrolling forward now, 20 years since we started, one wonders whether now we are on the verge of a new opportunity for national democratic reform. And a few months ago, I would say I was feeling incredibly encouraged by that. Now I'm getting a little bit more unsure. We could point to House of Lords reform. We could point to the fabulous civil servants that are really up for it at the moment. We could point to the Council of Nations and Regions, all being steps in the right direction, and the opportunity perhaps that's being presented by the devolution white paper. But personally, being involved in those latter two, I am not so sure that the appetite is quite so great as we might hope or expect. Let's put it simply that the jury is currently out. There is still a window of opportunity for democratic reform with this new Labour government, but it doesn't seem that big. And so therefore it's up to us, I think, to prise it open and to make it bigger and to seize the opportunities that are there. But national democratic reform is really only part of the story. Despite the deep political inertia and the regular disappointments over the past 20 years that we've seen on the national stage, Involve's passion and enthusiasm is undaunted. And many of us here will recognise that in spite of the seemingly strangling politics of the national system, in fact, there's been some huge opportunities and some huge developments and innovations in the wider democratic system. I'm thinking here of the amazing work that Involve has done through the ScienceWise programme, where public dialogue has been able to inform thinking on everything from genome editing to AI. I'm thinking of how we've supported the Scottish Government with its work to develop a citizens' minimum income guarantee, or in Northern Ireland, where we work with citizens to explore housing rights. I'm thinking of the amazing work we've done with local authorities on things like the Camden Data Charter or the Grenfell Support Programme. And I'm thinking of the way in which Involve has become a national, if not global, leader in putting citizens at the heart of tackling climate change and environmental degradation. We've taken climate change out of the technical sphere and made it a matter of public debate and deliberation. So 20 years on, we may still feel some way from the democratic transformation that we want to see on the national stage. But we're developing a new democratic instinct within that wider ecosystem. We're nurturing democratic muscle memory amongst a growing number of citizens who take part in deliberative processes and enjoy their engagement with them. And we're part of an international movement where eventually, I believe, the feedback loops will be too strong for the powers that be in this little island nation to persist in resisting it at the national level. So my message in opening this afternoon is very simple. Let's keep going. Let's keep innovating. And let's see whether the new Labour government can keep up with our pace. Now, I'm sure that our speakers this evening and our different activities this evening will have much more to say to encourage us. And so what I wanted to do just to finish is to thank a few people in advance. I want to thank the Involved team members who've played a huge part in arranging this evening's event, especially Steph, Daisy, Frankie, Adam and Mariana, and all the team members who've been here setting up. Yeah, thank you. I want to thank Westminster University for generously letting us use their venue here this evening. I want to thank the UKRI ScienceWise for their financial contribution and also for commissioning a special blog about the role that Simon Burrell has played in ScienceWise, which is going to be put up onto the website in the coming days. I want to thank in advance our speakers and panellists. I want to thank trustees. I can see some ex-trustees as well, so thank you for joining us, including some of our founding trustees too. I want to thank Involve staff members across the UK, some of whom perhaps can't make it here tonight. And I want to thank Sarah and the management team as well, who've got a vision not only for democracy, but also for how the organisation itself continues to learn and develop. And finally, I just want to thank you all for coming along. It's absolutely great to see such a full room again, and I hope that you can really enjoy the celebrations this evening. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to tell us a bit about what we're going to be doing together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Oh, hello. There's more people here now than there were when I sat down and started facing this way. So it's great to see that everyone has turned up. Hope you've all had the chance to have a drink. If you haven't, you will later. This is probably the biggest birthday party I've ever hosted. My own 20th was quite good, actually, now I think. But this I think is a really wonderful event. So thank you for coming along. So my job now quickly is to run down the programme of what we're going to do. And also, before I do that, I'm going to mention a few of the other ways that we're celebrating Involve's 20th year. I probably want to shout out particularly to some of my predecessors in the role of leading Involve. Tim Hughes is over there. Hello. Hooray. And also Rich Wilson, who's over here, and we'll hear from Rich a little bit later, the founder of Involve. As well as this event, we have on our website coming up in the next few days lots of interesting goodies. So the first one I think is already up is a timeline of Involve's history, which Tim has kindly prepared for us. And I think that's a really interesting story of the last 20 years, both for Involve and in terms of how deliberative democracy has sort of developed, has perhaps looked at some points like it was waning, but then was kind of consolidating and coming back, and hopefully we now think ready to really get over that tipping point and become the default way of doing democracy alongside representative democracy in this country and in the world. So we have that timeline, so thank you, Tim, for that. And we also have a blog from Rich, which is his thoughts, I think, on the start of Involve and how it is now. And also the other things that we have on that website, it's important to think of Simon Burrell, who is also the final member of the group who were directors of Involve and who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. We miss him very much. And also on the website we have some of his last thoughts. He left some thoughts about democracy, which we've turned into something that maybe is a bit like Simon's final blog, perhaps. We've also represented some of his most influential papers. And also science-wise, as Ed mentioned, has commissioned Diane Beddoes, who I don't know if Diane is here, but thank you, Diane. Yay. Diane has written a blog about Simon and the lessons that he teaches us, still teaches us, even though he's no longer here, about democracy and the way of being that helps us improve democracy. So we remember him. So on to this evening's programme. We have a great speaker who has just rushed over from Westminster, which is Tom Hayes MP, who I will introduce shortly. We then move into a panel discussion with other people who are here, and I will introduce them as well shortly. Then we have a bit of moving around for you and participative work. Actually, before that, we have Rich, who's going to say a few words as well. And then we have the moving around and learning and sharing from the whole audience. We have various people who've been involved in our projects, including members of the public who've been participants in our projects, who've really kindly given even more of their time to come and share with us how it's been for them. And we have the people who've commissioned that work and people who've been involved in delivering it to talk about what it feels like in practice. What we often hear is that we can talk about this all we like, but actually it's what it feels like when you're there that really makes the difference and really tends to convince people that this way of doing decision-making is an important one and is one that feels right for improving our society and strengthening those relational bonds between us and the bonds of democracy. So I think, and then we have drinks, and then we all go clubbing. Oh no, hang on, that's my birthday party again. I'm going to, without more ado, introduce Tom Hayes. We were, in a slightly changed to the advertised programme, Georgia Gould, the Minister Georgia Gould, was going to come along and talk to us about her work in Camden and her support for deliberative democracy. But Tom has very kindly agreed to come along as well, as in his experience, I think before becoming an MP, ran Climate Assembly in Oxford and will share whatever he wants to share, reflections from that and thoughts. So over to you, Tom. Thank you.
thank you very much for the invitation. I was in Central Lobby last night having a very nice conversation, and George Gould came bounding over to me, and I knew straight away in her eyes that she was about to ask me to do something. So I took a step back and said, "What is it?" And she said, "Involve." And I just stopped. I was like, "Yes, I'll do it. It's absolutely fine." I've worked with Involve previously when I was in Oxford. I was a councillor there for 10 years. And in that role, I also was deputy leader and cabinet member for Zero Carbon Oxford. And one of the things that we brought forward was a Citizens' Assembly on climate change. So I had worked with Involve both in terms of helping to design it, but then also disseminating the learnings from it. So, you know, you might have heard about your birthday party and how incredible that was, but I've got a feeling that on a Thursday evening when you get to come and speak with as many people here as there are about democracy and citizens' assemblies, this really is the place to be, and I'm really not joking. I'm very geeky about these things. So I just want to start by talking about Georgia. Many of you will know Georgia obviously from her time in Camden, but she's also a Minister of State in the Cabinet Office. And this is a mission-led government. It's a government that won a manifesto on the basis of 5 missions, and it's carrying those 5 missions into government. Now, Georgia obviously in local government led Camden Council, which itself was a mission-led council. And the reason I'm emphasising this is you have that experience from local government going into national government. You have that experience of trying new ways of learning and doing things going into national government. And although we're 104 days in, I think it's 104, I wanted to give you the assurance that this is a government which takes participatory democracy really seriously and takes missions really seriously indeed. Which brings me to talking about citizens' assemblies. So in Oxford, we are a city which has a very well-known university, has a quite large knowledge cluster, because of the employers that we've got in the city, has a population which is very interested in democracy and interested in pushing forward climate action. But it became very apparent to me that, and I mean this with the greatest respect, it became very apparent to me that the spaces I went into in that community were people who all looked and sounded the same, who all pretty much said the same words to describe the same things, and I was having the same conversations. And that's not to say that that point of view and those backgrounds are not important, but we know too that to tackle the climate and ecological emergency we face, that we need this to be something on which there is a broader consensus. And so the appeal of the Citizens' Assembly that we brought forward was to bring people with a range of viewpoints and backgrounds into a space over 2 weekends and truly understand some key things. What should be a council's ambition in a time of resource scarcity? What are the co-benefits that can come from delivering climate action, and which of those should we prioritise? How do we bring forward sustained and ongoing community engagement so that we have a consensus for climate action that carries forward into the longer term? And critically, what are some of the fears? And what are some of the messages that people hear which trigger alarm bells, so that we can try and neutralise those and emphasise the positives of climate action? And so in Oxford, we had 2 weekends of climate action. We appointed Ipsos Mori to take forward the Citizens' Assembly, and we decided to ask an exam question. And the exam question was, the UK government has passed legislation to reach net zero carbon by 2050. Should Oxford be more proactive and seek to achieve net zero sooner than 2050? And what trade-offs are we prepared to make? We deliberately asked that question without setting a time frame or a deadline, just to get a sense of people's ambition to go further. And the reason for that is that we realised that Assembly members may not understand how fast we go with our carbon action might have unintended trade-offs. They may not truly understand just how complex progress would be and how much it would rely on new technologies. They would have heard from varying experts in the room, but we also wanted at the voting stage for them to make an opinion based on what they'd heard, but with the opportunity for further reflection. And we also wanted to make progress as a council and as a city, but we were also conscious that there may be some nervousness among Assembly members about identifying a date. It might deter them from actually just being really explicit about what they wanted the actions to be. And so we convened an advisory board. We had a representation from every single political party on it. We had experts in participatory democracy and citizens' assemblies, and we had representatives of the community on that panel, and we heard absolutely fantastic things. I'd been keen on having a citizens' assembly ahead of actually ploughing into the work of an advisory board, but the work of that advisory board was transformative. It managed to build a consensus in the council for a quite large expenditure at a time of budgets having to be cut. And it also managed to build a sense in our city that we were going places, that we were trying to galvanise action. And then when we had those 2 weekends in Oxford, we looked at 5 different themes. We looked at housing, we looked at waste, we looked at buildings, we looked at transport, and we looked at biodiversity. And I now get a pat on the back for remembering all 5 of those 5 years on from doing it. And in each of those areas, we explored what the situation was, what some of the changes could be, what some of the trade-offs could be, and we painted 3 visions of a future. We deliberately wanted it to be optimistic and to look forward, and we had different scenarios against which were different costs and different opportunities. And then we did the voting at the end. Obviously, the votes were taken on the basis of people feeling informed about what these situations would be in the trade-offs, because we had expert speakers coming in. But for each of those 5 themes, everybody in that room, from a range of viewpoints and backgrounds, wanted to go further and faster. The overall result was that 90% of Assembly members on that exam question voted yes. Now, I think that's pretty remarkable. There were people in that room who I know that when I went canvassing as a Labour Party activist, I would have knocked on their door and they would have shut the door in my face. Politics was not for them. They told me as much. They said that they just don't find it interesting, their lives are too busy, the state doesn't help them to get involved by providing childcare at an affordable rate or other things. But what I really took from people's contributions was that they came along in some cases on a wing and a prayer. The honorarium helped. It gave them a feeling of permission to take part because they could afford to care for elderly people or their children. But in being in that room and receiving the information they did, they became animated about the issue. They became animated about the process, and they became animated about the people. And I will always remember a young mum who was leaving on the first weekend, and she was talking to somebody I was very familiar with because she emailed me all the time, and she was one of those people that I had been set up as Citizens' Assembly, frankly, to slightly get away from. But through the independent and fair process of sortition, happened to be in the room. And they left the building arm in arm, almost, with the young mum basically going, I just don't think it's right that you in North Oxford, which for those who don't know Oxford is a reasonably well-off area, managed to get all the driveways to charge your electric cars, that you managed to get all the community investment to have your low-carbon groups, and that you've got all the time to be able to pull community activity together. I'm not settling for that. And I can now report, because I checked in when Georgia Gould asked me to step in for her, I did a little bit of digging into how things were going back in Oxford. She has set up her own low-carbon group in her community, which is mostly comprised of a council estate. She's been bidding like crazy for funding in order that she can take community group projects forward. She remains firm friends with the person in North Oxford, although deeply resentful that she doesn't yet have a driveway to charge her electric vehicle on. But this is some of the work that can come from a Citizens' Assembly. You can really see change happening. And I'm just going to close by saying that I'm always struck by the Maya Angelou quote, which is, do the best that you can until you know better, and when you know better, do better. And I feel like the Citizens' Assembly that we held, the process of holding and learning from a Citizens' Assembly speaks to that quotation. We've got a heck of a lot to get right as a government. We've got a heck of a lot to get right at the community level. But by talking, you find the solutions. By learning, you innovate. And all of us together can build a better world. And I feel very confident that organisations like Evolve, people like you, and celebrations like this can really bring forward that better world. So thank you for inviting me, thank you for being here, and thank you for all that you're doing to strengthen our democracy and deliver the social justice and action that we need.
Thank you so much, Tom. What lovely, rousing words and a great sentiment and fantastic lived experience of doing that assembly and what that's changed in you and what that's changed in the community in Oxford. So thank you very much for stepping in. We'll tell Georgia that that's much the best option.
Do not say that. She's a Minister of State.
This is true, this is true. So I'm going to move quickly onto our panel because I really want to make sure that we have time to hear from everybody. We have a panel now which we've called What Next for the Participatory Society. So can I invite our panellists to come up? I think Patrick's going to come here. Yes, thank you. So we have three great panellists here, and we have one who's joining us online. During this panel, there is an element of online participation, and then afterwards there'll be some real-life voice-based participation. So please, if you want to scan the QR code, and you get Mentimeter, which if you're not familiar with it, allows you to ask questions. If someone has asked a question like the one you'd like to ask, you can upvote it, and hopefully that will then come through to me later on, and I can ask the panellists these questions. I am not going to talk a great deal to set the scene. I might just say one or two words. I think Tom did a great job in setting the scene. But I just wanted to kind of pose a few thoughts and a few questions about where we are now and where we can go. And we've heard this a little already from Ed and from Tom about really the challenges that our societies face, for which participation and deliberation can be some of the remedy. And we're not standing here saying this is the magic bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. But there are some significant challenges that we face that we think this work can really kind of make a difference to. So, you know, we know that our politics at the moment doesn't inspire trust and confidence in people. You know, even if you've got a boost from the new government, or if you've got a boost from something else that you support and are voting for, that it's built a little bit on sand, and people are not feeling deeply and ultimately trusting of politics and of the system. A lot of people feel left out and not listened to. In fact, probably most people feel left out and not listened to, which begs the question, who is being listened to, which is quite an interesting one. And then going even bigger, our economies are not sustainable. They're not able to be resilient and change to accommodate the huge changes we're going to have to make in the way we live globally. And that discussion, we haven't even started having it in any country. And Rich maybe will talk about the global assembly that he's starting to set up, which perhaps can start to address some of this. And in the UK, our infrastructure, our public services, they're not resilient, they're not flexible to the changes that they need to make to serve people. And as I say, better decision making and decision making that involves more people is not going to solve all these problems. But I think we need to use the things that we know about how to make decisions better and how to make better decisions. So if we bring in those who have vital knowledge and lived experience, not only do they have a better time, and we heard from Tom about the experience of the people that came to his assembly in Oxford, not only do they have a better time and build a better relationship with decision makers, but the actual decisions are improved and strengthened, and it's more likely that people will come along with the decision afterwards and go along with what's been agreed if people like them have been involved in that process. And so I think the what's next for me is about making participatory democracy an expected part of policy development, of tackling the big stuck challenges that successive governments have not been able to tackle because there's fragmentation and polarisation in people's views. And as a way to help us build and share a narrative and a vision for our country. There's a lot of debate about whether Keir Starmer's got a vision, whether anyone else has got a vision, what is a vision anyway, what is strategy for the country. A lot of that kind of worry on the surface, I think, can be addressed by saying, well, look, let's just ask people, bring them in, share people's judgment, not just ask their opinions in a succession of opinion polls, but bring their judgment in as well. And so I think the main point I want to land really is that this isn't some sort of kooky new idea, is it? It's something that we've been doing for 20 years. Other countries have been doing for a long time. We need to sort of get it over the top of the mountain in this country, and we need to get it established as a normal, everyday part of democracy. So how do we do that? And that's the challenge that I want to give to our panellists. I'm going to come to Patrick first. I'll introduce Patrick. Excuse me. Patrick Hurley is the MP for Southport and the Northern Parishes. He's come to Parliament freshly this time, congratulations. After 12 years in Liverpool Council, he's worked at the RSA. He's very interested in economics, class-based analysis of social problems, and he has to leave to get on a train quite soon. So I'm going to hand over to you, and then maybe we might have one or two questions just to you, if that's all right, and then you can head.
Yeah, I appreciate it. The life of an MP being as it is, I'm booked on the 7:10 train from Euston back up north. So apologies that I'll be scooting off slightly early, but that is the nature of the life. Why, as a newly elected MP, am I speaking to you this evening about giving power away? And to answer that question, I'm going to touch on why I became an MP in the first place, why I decided to stand for Parliament, and what I want to achieve. So, you may remember back in 2020, whilst COVID was ravishing the country and we were all locked up in our houses, every night we would have the 5 p.m. press conference on the television. You'd have your experts at one podium on either side, and then in the middle would be the politician. And it would be the politician that would decide, this week you're in Tier 3. Next week, you're not going to be able to travel outside your local authority boundary. The week after, you're not going to be able to see your in-laws. The week after that, you are going to be able to see one set of your in-laws, but not the... And I'm sure, just like everybody else, I'm sat at home on my couch with my wife going, you don't know what you're talking about, do you? Shouting at my television. Poor Matt Hancock, he got shouted at so often during 2020 in my house. And I think my wife must have got utterly sick of me because she said, well, Patrick, if you think you can do any better, stand for Parliament yourself. And 4 years later, God help me, I became an MP, and here I am saying I am going to try and do a bit better than what happened during 2020. But part of doing that better means I am not going to be that person that stands up in front of a crowd or goes on television or goes on radio and pontificates about things of which I know so little it's untrue. MPs are supposed to be experts in everything, and you're overwhelmed with your post bag, seeking your views on any number of minority concerns that I had never considered in my life up until this moment in time. And I don't have the answers, and I want to be the MP. I want to be an MP that says, if I don't know the answer to a question, I will say I don't know the answer to the question. But the way to get an answer is involvement, is participation, is democratic engagement. The way to get an answer is to get a group of 100 people in a room and say, does anyone else know what's going on here? And seek the expert advice and seek the lived experience and seek the knowledge that comes from getting the engaged and knowledgeable and informed people in a community to advise and to make the decisions yourself. This doesn't obviously come without problems. One of my opponents in the election in July went to the electorate of Southport with a very, very clear policy platform that he called the Assembly. And his policy platform was he would set up community by community, village by village, people's assemblies across the constituency. Essentially, he wanted to set up the People's Republic of Southport with a series of Soviets that would make autonomous decisions that would then send him to Parliament to implement. He had no thought as to how you would decide who would be part of these. There would be no process of sortition. It would just be whoever wanted to turn up on a Friday night would turn up. And we need to be guarding against and mindful of the potential issues around always the loudest voice in the room making the decisions. Because in my experience, and perhaps in yours too, it's actually always the quietest voice in the room that makes the most thoughtful contribution when they finally do stand up and have the confidence to say what's on their mind. Having said all that, I am fully in favour of democratic reform, pushing power, pushing decision-making capacity and capability down to the lowest level. I was very pleased that I voted for House of Lords reform in the vote earlier this week. Just slightly disappointed that we didn't go even further and abolish the whole thing, but maybe in another 25 years, once these changes have embedded. I hope to live to see it. I'm 48. If it happens by the time I'm 73, I will die a happy man, because we do need to abolish the House of Lords. So I think on that note, I will stop, because I do need to get to a train station, and I'm happy to take a few questions beforehand.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think we will, if that's all right. If there is one or two questions just for Patrick, I know it's an unconventional way to do a panel, and the others are having to wait, I'm afraid. But yeah, is there anything that anyone would like to ask?
What's the first step for you to make that happen?
So the question was, what's the first step for me to make that happen? First step, I think, is work within the system that we're currently in. We live in a representative democracy with first past the post, and we need to make the changes based on the system that we're currently in. And that, I know that some of you are, former MPs or politically engaged throughout your life. You will know that I need to persuade the merits of that to my colleagues, particularly the merits of that to the ministers and the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. Without us working the game, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, then we're playing a game that we're not being invited to get involved in. So I need to make the case to my colleagues in Parliament to make sure that perhaps the lessons learned from 2008, 2009, when Ed was last trying to, with Hazel Blears, bring this forward, maybe we'll try again and learn the lessons of that.
Thank you. So perhaps the question for us becomes, how can we support you and Tom and Georgia and all the other MPs who are trying to move this forward within the system we have? There was a hand went up at the back. Can I just take that one quickly? Was that you? Yeah. Were you the original hand? All right, yeah. You were, okay.
Completely agree with you about the House of Lords. I wonder if, as a fan of citizens' assemblies, if you support replacing it with a permanent citizens' assembly.
Okay, so should we replace the Lords with a permanent citizens' assembly? Yes, why not? I mean, we can't do much worse than having people be legislators by dint of the birthright that their ancestors had won a war in 1172 or whatever nonsense it is that makes these decisions. I would very much like the House of Commons to be reformed on a PR basis with a constituency link retained, but constituency by constituency on a PR basis. And whilst we're at it, we're going to need a second legislative chamber. I can well see the merits of a permanent citizens' assembly in place of the Lords. Case in point, we've got a potential vote coming up next month, a free vote on assisted dying, and I think that a citizens' assembly would very much be welcome to make sure that we've got the views of the population at large, and also making sure that the legislation which is eventually passed is as thoughtful as it needs to be to prevent abuse.
Thank you.
Okay.
There are lots of other things that we could ask you, and I'm
sure.
sorry you can't stay for the whole panel, but do go and catch your train. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thanks, everyone.
Now, moving on, I might come to Jeff next. So Jeff Mulgan's Professor of Collective Intelligence at UCL and many other things as well. I'm going to hand straight over to you so that we have time for your remarks, if that's all right.
Okay, and I'm going to stand up because I'm not very good at sitting, and that's not a very comfortable chair, to be honest. So I was the first chair of Involve, which is why I'm here, and I have very mixed emotions being at this 20th birthday party. So the good thing is I think this is a community full of incredibly likeable people, a rather unusually likeable community. The sun is shining, I've got a party bag, there's balloons. Involve survived, and it's not easy for small NGOs to survive. So there's a lot to celebrate. On the other hand, it makes me feel really old, being at a 20th anniversary. It is very sad we don't have Simon Burrell with us. I think he was an absolute model of quiet radicalism, which I think this country does really well. And in some ways, I think it's sad Involve is still needed so much. So you asked me to say a tiny bit about what's happened in the last 20 years. The premise of Involve was in some ways very simple, that we'd inherited a way of governing where governments did things to people and for people, not with them. We had a model of democracy where you're essentially a passive spectator who every few years gets to put a piece of paper in a box. We have an essentially 19th century machinery of democracy, parliaments, elections, and so on, almost completely untouched by the revolutions of technology of the last 30 or 40 years. And this was bound to become a problem, bound to undermine trust, bound to undermine belief, legitimacy of democracy as a whole, as we've seen in the polling all over the world since then. And I think the key insight of Involve, and Richard and the team, was to go from that diagnosis to detailed prescription, the detail of how you involve people, which is different at a neighborhood level or on science or on big complex policy problems, that we needed a lot of people who really understood the fine grain of method and how you can engage participation and get beyond generalities. As Ed said at the beginning, the last 20 years in some ways has seen a deliberative wave. Claudia Kvalish, when she was at the OECD, measured all these, the explosion of citizens' assemblies and juries and deliberative methods, the V-Taiwans and so on. I went in my last job at Nesta, we helped run Dissent, which created new tools in Barcelona and Madrid, now used, I think, in 30 countries to help everyday involvement in decision making. And far more has been learned about how you do this stuff well. Again, the craft knowledge, which I think Involve is so good at. But I think we still have a very long way to go. And in some ways, what hasn't happened is really the synthesis, the integration of all of that into the mainstream operation of governments, of parliaments, and of parties. And that, for me, really is the task of the next 5 or 10 years. I hope this new government does use these methods, because I think otherwise we'll face so many blockages. Blockages on tax, blockages on planning, blockages on climate policy. We need a new way of having an honest national conversation about what's possible. And the old methods of sort of top-down, media-driven politics simply don't work anymore. So just 2 final comments on this. Have any of you been to the London Film Festival, which is on this week? Yeah. Nobody does. You're all really serious people. I'm a bit of a film obsessive. There are actually quite a few films about democracy. There's the very weird one about electing a pope, if you're really interested, which is a slightly strange... you probably will never be asked to advise on papal conclaves.
We would take that job, yeah.
But the 2 other films, one is The Seed of the Sacred Fig Tree. It's an extraordinary Iranian film, really about the teenage girls who fought with incredible bravery to get democracy in Iran. I really recommend that one. And then if you want to be really depressed, The Apprentice, about Donald Trump's formation, is a reminder that actually there are 2 waves happening worldwide at the moment. Yes, there is a deliberative wave, which is a response to feelings of disempowerment, dissatisfaction with democracy, but the other wave, which is a response to exactly the same emotions, says let's put our hope in a Donald Trump, in an Erdogan, in a Modi. 2 days ago, I live in Luton, I was in a conversation with some of my neighbours, 20-something, mainly men, all of whom would have voted for Donald Trump if they were in America, because they thought he'll fix things. They didn't want to be involved. They just wanted to have faith in some tough guy who would solve the problems. So looking back 20 years, yes, a lot's been achieved, but actually the stakes are much higher now. Because now the choice really is whether we go forward, whether we reinvent democracy for this century, for this era, or the alternative is not standing still. The alternative is going sharply backwards. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I think that's the world we're in at the moment, and that's in a way why Involve matters so much and why it's so important that really bright, energetic people put their lives, their energy into this mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Matters. Over to you, Daya. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everybody. I think I quite nicely follow on from what Jeff was just talking about. Just in the context of where there's an increase in the far right and populist movements, eroding kind of democratic values and human rights and civil liberties, while also kind of on the other hand, where groups haven't experienced the state as a benevolent force in their lives, you've got this kind of hostile environment where groups don't feel like they're able to participate, where it feels like there's some groups that we don't hear from. And that's not just because they don't have anything to say, but I argue that it's because they're not connected to the structures of power and structures in which they're actively their views are actively sought. I think Evolve is doing some work around power and thinking about how these dynamics play out in participatory and deliberative processes. So right from kind of where we're recruiting from, right up to kind of when we're in the room, how are we thinking about how power dynamics play out, which is really interesting. I think one thing that I do say as a critical friend to the participatory and deliberative movement is this over-reliance on sortation, this idea to try and get a representative of the population in a room. But what happens is, because some groups are in the minority, they will always be in the minority in these spaces, and you're not always going to be able to access their particular lived experiences, because there's something, this is the academic community, there's something about kind of whether their experiences can be understood, on whether their experiences will be believed. And so it restricts kind of, that ability to share, which is part of co-creating knowledge within participatory and deliberative processes. I know colleagues from Involve are also considering how their own privileges might make them blind to recognizing or understanding experiences, even including kind of the agenda setting. So what are the issues that should be considered by participatory and deliberative processes? Which is, I guess, moving on to sort of my provocations, if I can, really is, as we are thinking and moving, celebrating kind of the last 20 years, and people have spoken to deliberative wave and kind of the moving to and how to influence policy. So I want to think about sort of the next 20 years. What are some of the things that it would be great to see put in place? I think what I want to sort of speak to really is this two things. The first one is again, an over-reliance on talk as the basis of deliberation, and how actually there's some groups that can't participate within that. So I want to speak to sort of the fluidity of the participatory processes that are used in this space. So thinking about how could we, how do we support community and grassroots organizing? One of my colleagues, Liam Killen at Lancaster, talks about insurgent spaces, so spaces outside of state-initiated processes or state-sponsored processes, and but then there's that sort of thinking about how do you then connect that back to policy, influencing policy, like Jeff was just talking about. And in terms of the fluidity of processes, I'm thinking about, so just before I came here, I was working with Lancashire Citizens, and we basically put a bus outside different places, speaking with marginalized groups on the issues of public transport. That could then influence kind of a citizens' assembly on public transport issues, or if we were going to use legislative theatre, for example, to think about how to activate. I think someone was talking about the way that participatory processes activate citizens. How can we, rather than kind of rigidly thinking about these processes as individuals, but how can we integrate different arts-based methods that encourage this multivocality of co-producing the knowledge that influences policy? I think my sort of final thing is, recognizing that Involve has a pragmatic approach to making sure it's connected to policy making, and in terms of how to make sure these voices are heard and amplified, is, and for all of you in the room as well, is thinking about how do you curate spaces to hear these experiences? How are you going to be bridge builders between these communities and being relational with these communities, rather than kind of going in when you have 2 weekends? How do you kind of build that relationship, continuing the relationship with these communities, so that they're there influencing kind of the agenda, influencing the design of the process, and so forth. And so it's managing kind of the relational power upwards, and I don't want to say downwards, but sideways maybe. And I think, I'm gonna stop there, because I think I have mentioned the things I want to talk about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. can hang on to the microphone for a moment. We'll use it for in a minute. And our final speaker on this panel can't be with us in person, but is here virtually. Hello, Donna. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear really well. You okay?
We're very well. So this is Professor Donna Hall. Oh, our panel's come and sit down to look at you.
Okay.
This is Donna Hall, who's currently a non-exec advisor to a range of organisations, Carnell Farrow Mutual Ventures. She's the chair of an innovative social care enterprise, Possibilities. You may probably know her. She's probably most famous as the ex-CEO in Wigan who brokered the Wigan deal, so knows a lot about shifting power in practice, perhaps in real life. Donna, would you like to give your remarks?
Yeah, no problem. And first of all, happy birthday. It's brilliant that you've, as Jeff said, lasted so long in what's becoming, I think, quite a crowded space with think tanks and other organisations increasingly getting the need to address participation as an essential part of public policy. But I think there's a massive chasm between what is said at a kind of national level and then what is done on the ground. So my background is the doing, the delivery side of trying to unravel government policy and make it work for citizens and communities on the ground in places, mainly in the north of England. But I'm now working kind of all over the country and Scotland and Wales. And what I'm seeing is a real change since COVID. Right at the very beginning of the pandemic, I think there was a huge kind of looking outwards to communities, all the mutual aid work, people trying to find different ways of delivering services. But I think it's actually created a very kind of top-down command and control way of working in public services. So we've kind of forgotten what we're for. And the public and the servants bit has kind of gone. And we've very much embraced, I think, in the last 4 years, this kind of new public management way of working. And it's really become deeply embedded. Much more deeply than it was before. So with the deal, it was trying to recreate the relationship between the citizen and the state. That was the whole idea, a new social contract between citizen and state, because we recognised that the whole concept of new public management was broken. And we didn't want to just involve people in kind of managing a broken system in more meaningful ways. What we wanted to do was get their ideas around working completely differently with a new system, a new social contract, a new dynamic, much more of a kind of human-to-human relationship between the public servant and the people they serve, rather than seeing them as passive recipients of need, various bits of need that we tend to separate into different council departments or NHS services, usually illness-related, and not really focused on the person, their family, their support network, the assets and the strengths in those communities and those neighbourhoods. And we tend to just individually work with them, and it doesn't work. It's hugely expensive. You will have heard about the liberated method, which is very similar to the work we did in Wigan, up in Gateshead. And they're really trying hard to start with the person. But what they're finding is that the whole new public management system stops them from doing that, because basically it's very much a kind of command and control, commissioned service based on the need. What's wrong with you? Not what's strong in a local community. And it's that whole culture shift that we need to move, particularly within the NHS. I've chaired an NHS trust. I've seen how it operates. You see the increase in spending in the NHS and the deepening of the individual silos since the creation of integrated care systems that were meant to try to put the citizen at the centre of health and social care decision-making, but has spectacularly failed to do that. In my experience of working as an NHS England advisor with 42 systems, they're not involving citizens in the meaningful way that was set out in the guidance. So for me, it's about leadership appetite for change at both the national and the local level, both political and managerial, and understanding that if we carry on trying to manage new public management, we're going to fail. It's not going to work. So we need to get ideas from residents. We need to make sure we start with the person. We used anthropology extensively in Wigan in the design of the deal. So we worked with Nesta and an anthropologist to try to create a different relationship to get actual people to listen. It sounds a very basic thing, but to listen differently without judgment, without putting people into the individual silos of need. What I'm finding is It is very much about a radical place leadership, an approach to leadership at the place level that recognises that if we carry on trying to manage decline, we're going to fail. We have to work differently with residents. The power needs to be shifted back to them. And I really love citizens panels, but they're not going to bring about on their own the change that's needed. I think it needs a completely different redefining of the role of a public servant and a massive shift of power to communities, huge investment in the social infrastructure, in the community and voluntary sector. That's what they're doing up in Gateshead. It's what we did in Wigan. And between us, we managed to add an additional 7 years of healthy life expectancy in the most deprived wards. That wasn't by having meetings with people. It was by investing in the community and social infrastructure in prevention relentlessly. And, doing things like freezing council tax and not just passing the burden of the increasing cost and demand pressures of a system that is broken. It effectively is. So sorry to be a bit different to the other speakers, but I think I'm a bit worn down by years of trying to do it, and it is hard on the coalface and harder. I think this next 12 months, speaking to local government, chief execs and leaders, is going to be the toughest of all, I'll be honest. But thank you.
Thank you, Donna, and hopefully the solidarity of being with others who are also working on it can help us with our slightly, jaded exhaustion that I hear from the work that you've been doing for a long time. Can the other panel members come back? We have a few questions. I don't want to go on too long because I really want to get the chance to talk about the projects that we have as well and give everyone a chance to have another drink, move around, all of that. But I would like to ask the panellists some questions, and we've had a few coming through on the Mentimeter, and I shall try and consolidate them a little. We've heard sort of different perspectives, I think, on how we get this participatory society a bit more embedded. Donna talked about sort of asset-based perspectives and really changing the role of public servants. Deo, you touched on that sort of how do we really value new knowledge and different ways of doing things that aren't so sort of ossified in privilege and just doing things the same way as before. And Jeff gave a really, I think, a warning that if we don't change, then the autocracy is waiting in the wings for us to be, for us to not succeed. We've had questions on here about. We've had questions about big tech, we've had questions about MPs. I just wanted to ask a broad question. I guess in 20 years, if we succeed, what is going to be really different about a participatory society? What's going to feel different for people and in government and for the issues of the time? What would success look like, I suppose, for each panel member?
I will abuse the privilege because I'm holding the mic, so I'll go first. I think for me it would be that participatory democracy is every day, and it's in every single institution. So from school councils in schools where young people and teenagers are getting an understanding of how participation works, to sort of, so in the workplace where trade unions are much more kind of not. Like there's trade union agreements in every workplace. The council, you've got a lot of people sort of being involved in, whether that's standing citizens panels. So for me, it would be that participatory society is every day in every kind of social institution.
So I'll give three answers. One really echoes what Donna said. I think there's no point reforming democracy if you don't also reform how government and public services work. And I won't repeat what you said, but I think that's a key aspect of this, is a different model of health, of education, of social care, and of housing, an everyday democracy, which allows people to take part, though only as much as they want to. Most people don't want to go to meetings very much. I don't want to be involved in most things government does, but some things I really want to have the chance to have a say. So I think it's important the vision isn't one of everyone spending all their time in a meeting, which, as you said, is sometimes a bit of a nightmare. Then I think there's a key question of legibility. I published a little quiz earlier this year, 10 questions about how decisions are made in your local area. And I found most people, including quite a few MPs, could not answer most of those questions or got them wrong. We have an incredibly opaque system of decision-making at the moment, which I think is part of the problem. I don't think you can have a viable democracy unless it's relatively straightforward who makes what kind of decisions, who you hold to account for the things which really shape your life. And finally, all of that only matters if it gives you, self-efficacy, if it makes you feel in control of your lives. That's the ultimate test. And really, any reform or innovation which doesn't ultimately make people feel they are, in charge of their own destiny to some extent, then it's a failure.
Okay, thank you. Donna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just briefly. So some of the places I work with, I would define the people trying to make change happen and change the relationship with citizens as members of the Rebel Alliance, because they are fighting against a system that tries to stop them involving people, tries to get them to see, Commissioner knows best. We don't involve people. That's too dangerous and it takes too long. What's all this hippie nonsense? So for me, it would be to normalise the involvement of people to achieve such a massive cultural shift that you don't need to be a member of a Rebel Alliance to make change happen. It's just normalised 365 days a year. I think it's also important that we revolutionise the political voting system. So the turnout in Wigan was around 20% in a local election, a bit higher in a national. The election turnout for the mayoral combined authority was 17% for Andy Burnham. There's something, and it's a massive Labour area, but there's a huge amount to do there to get people to see the value of voting. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Lots of great thoughts there. I'm going to take one question from the floor because I need to move on to our panel. So no pressure to ask an amazing question. Would anyone like to reflect or ask something? Disagree. Or disagree, yeah, exactly. I saw a hand go up there. Person there? Yeah, hello. Thank you. What a wonderful question to wind up with, and I will repeat it so that Donna can hear on the microphone. If I've heard it right, what are the tipping points that we can recognise on the way to building a more participatory democracy, where all this stuff works and will happen? What are the steps we'll see on the way there, and what are the maybe red flags to watch out for or warning signs along the way? So, any reflections on that?
Well, maybe just one attempt. Prompted, I guess, by about a year and a half ago, it became clear across Europe the biggest barriers to climate action were no longer sort of technical ones of policy or design. They were entirely sort of political ones about buy-in, understanding. So I started some work with a slightly different exam question to this, which was, how do you run a conversation at the level of a whole society now, where the people who felt threatened in the Netherlands or in France and Germany, felt threatened by climate action, were part of a process of understanding. And I think that takes you to rather different places than some of the participatory methods, because it's vital, it's not just an assembly or a jury, it has to be touching millions of people, which means you have to involve the mass media, the traditional parties. You needed, I won't go into the detail, but we looked at examples from around the world of where there were reasonably good cases of most of the population feeling they had been part of an authentic, deep conversation which acknowledged difficult trade-offs, that some people would make sacrifices, but there would ideally be some payoff for future generations. And I fear if we don't do that for climate action, we don't actually invent some rather new methods, we will find, as it were, politics and backlashes from the more rural, perhaps the less educated, perhaps the older, perhaps more men, will block necessary action all over the world.
Thank you. Maybe Donna, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I think it's how to measure an increase in trust or a restoration of trust. Trying to find different ways to do that. And I think the red flag issues are, it is back to me every time is culture and leadership, that you've got leaders who are up for change and trying new things, and they've got the courage to do it, political and managerial, and not just resort back to the comfort blanket of what they know, which we know doesn't work as well.
Thank you.
So I think for me, a tipping point will be when, I guess, politicians and bureaucrats are more willing to share power, and it's no longer seen as a polarized issue, and don't want to touch it with a bad pill, or it becomes a wicked problem or too difficult, and it just keeps kind of being pushed down, and they have the courage to say, actually, we're going to tackle it, this is how we're going to do it. The red flag for me would be if participatory and deliberative democracy are still replicating the same structures of exclusion. So they're not still kind of actually thinking about how to widely include people who have not been able to have their say in some of these issues. So those who are, so using the climate change example, those in the global south who are most going to be the ones like bearing the brunt of the climate change and not getting a say or a seat at the table, an international table. It needs to be kind of, and it's that global coordination that's needed, I think. And I don't know whether we've got the leadership or the institutional structures to support. But if we start to see some of those kind of conversations happening globally, then I would be more kind of optimistic about that. But I think at the minute I'm just like, I'm not sure. We'll see.
Can I just one sentence?
Okay, very short.
So a really striking pattern around the world, most of the radical reformers come from new political parties, like in Taiwan, like in Italy and Spain and so on. And it's hard to do it within big old parties. It's why Graham and Stella, you're the exceptions in a way. And in our country, unfortunately, the only really big new party is Reform, which is probably not going to be a great champion of this stuff. So it's really important that champions within Labour, Lib Dems and Tories are empowered, and that you really, in a sense, integrate with the old structures, because in most of the world, old parties have killed all of these innovations and reforms. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, etc.
Thank you. Great. Well, some yeah, careful of that. Some really thought-provoking, rich discussions there, and thank you for listening. I'm sorry it's been chalk and talk so much when we promised you a panel, but we've had so much kind of rich thoughts from all of our panellists and from Tom as well and Patrick. So please just give it up for this panel one more time.